Ethical perspective. Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV 9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator today, Karl Cassell, President and CEO of Horizons, a Family Service Alliance. Thank you for joining us this morning. And our topic today is, are we becoming a culture of fear? Does it exist? Why? And what do we do to manage or eliminate it? I am joined today by my three esteemed panelists that will help us discuss this topic by giving us their perspective and insight. To my immediate left, we have Tori Barnes-Brus, Associate Professor of Sociology at Cornell. Good morning.
Good morning.
To her immediate left, we have Todd Dorman, columnist for the Gazette.
Good morning, Carl.
Good morning. And on our end, we have Damsteegt from Family Psychology Associates.
Good morning, Carl.
Thank you. Thank you guys for joining me this morning, and we'll get right into it. Culture of fear, by definition, or the climate of fear, is used by scholars, writers, journalists, and politicians who believe that some in society incite fear in the general public to achieve political goals. And it's also applied in the workplace. And so what we want to do is really deal with, are we living today in a culture of fear more than before? And if so, how do we mitigate some of that fear through our different outlets, the media, with politicians? How do we tone that rhetoric down? And so just to kind of open it up, and anyone feel free to jump in, please. How does this play itself out at a local level with catchphrases such as politics of fear, fear of crime, fear of the future, fear of a financial collapse, those sort of catchphrases? How do you see that playing itself out at a local level?
I don't know about fear. It's intentionally instilled by someone who's trying to create fear, which I'm sure there are some. But I know that I am personally more careful. We currently have a person's car that we're storing, and I was worried about leaving it on the street. Maybe it should be in the driveway in case, somebody would try to break in. It's not the kind of thing you would think about in years past, so you should be careful all the time. Lock the doors, always.
Well, I mean, I think, local media coverage of crime can sometimes magnify, magnify how people feel about the frequency of crime. I mean, you can have, especially in a certain neighborhood, I mean, we hear at the Gazette, we hear criticism, and some of it's, right and constructive, that, when we, talk about a crime maybe in the Wellington Heights neighborhood, we talk about that crime being in the Wellington Heights neighborhood, whereas a crime might happen, less frequently in Bowman Woods, and we might not mention the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So we may, in doing that, sort of, create this, I don't know if it's necessarily cultural fear, but create this idea that that's a neighborhood where you should be fearful because look at all the crime that happens there, when in reality, thousands of people live there that aren't victims of crime. Mm-hmm. And I mean, those are things that the media has to be careful of.
And some of this has to do with the way news is constructed and having sources and official places to go to get your information. So if you have a rapport with a particular police station or a particular neighborhood, then you're more likely to report news on that. You asked specifically about the local level, but one thing that we do know is that the word fear, or the use of fear in news coverage nationally, has increased since the late 90s. So catchphrases, headlines that are using the word fear or terror have been on the rise, even as crime rates nationally have declined.
Yeah. And so let's continue with sort of the media's portraying of crime specifically. So a local news story, so the channel or the 10 o'clock news comes on. And the opening story is a tragic story about a shooting, per se, in a certain part of the city, as you mentioned. And then what we do, we'll play that up, we'll talk about how many other crimes have been committed in that part of town, and then we instantly shift to severe weather and all the terrible weather that we're having. And does that drive or maintain fear in the locals, and does that cause people to want to live here? If they're seeing this is how your local news station is carrying stories, would that encourage me as someone maybe even considering living here? Maybe I'm here on a business trip and might want to relocate. If this is how your news opens every night, would I want to live here?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in journalism about, what's the value of crime coverage? I mean, we cover crime, but, as far as should it lead a newscast or should it be on the front page? I mean, a lot of times there's a discussion, is this have value beyond sort of just the, I don't know, I guess the sensational details of whatever that particular crime is? I mean, is this part of a broader trend? Does it include, some sort of information that maybe is necessary for people, like, obviously if the criminal is still at large, that makes it more important to convey that news than maybe if this is just a crime that happened, suspect has been apprehended, and we're just sort of leading because, well, it's interesting and we have nice video, flashing lights and things. But I mean, that's always a tough call. And I think, in the newspaper business, which is, I'm not a television journalist, I'm only in the newspaper and online, but I think a lot of times we have done a pretty good job of sort of trying to give some context. The problem is, as you say, with that context, sometimes you end up painting a neighborhood perhaps with a broad brush that it doesn't deserve.
Anybody else?
Well, I think that part of what you're asking is really about local news here in our community. But these are trends nationally as well. So to say that the news here is more sensational, or how is that shaping this community, I think if we were to look systematically at local news in different parts of the country, you would see similar kinds of stories. And TV particularly lends itself to this sort of infotainment news and this flashy, like you mentioned, flashy graphics or catchphrases to draw viewers in. So as far as how is the audience or the community responding to that or bringing them in, I'm not sure, but my guess is that we wouldn't see much variance in how the news is portrayed and how these types of stories are portrayed in other communities as well.
Well, and when you hear the phrase culture of fear, the first thing I think of is growing up, child abductions. I was a kid, I was young. I think there were the two paper boys in Des Moines that were abducted, Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin. Yep. And we had the kids on the milk cartons, and there was just this feeling, the sense that this was just a massive epidemic and that parents had to be frightened, to let their kids go out and play. And I think that, played into the minds of folks my age and older and younger who were living through that. And that's, now that we raise our children, I think we're a lot more wary. There's a lot been written about, helicopter parents and not letting their kids just sort of run wild like we did when we were kids. We would run out the door at 8 in the morning and not come back until it was time for dinner. So I think that, that's an example of the media sort of taking individual stories that were, of course, compelling, because, nothing's more compelling than a missing child. But what we were missing is sort of the context that, this is happening, it's bad, but it's not the sort of epidemic that, the amount of time being given to the subject isn't commensurate to what, the actual frequency of these crimes happening. And it did sort of an idea that in parents' minds that this was something that could happen at any time to any child, when in reality, a lot of times these were acquaintances and really bizarre circumstances, and they didn't have a lot to fear.
I wonder if, by the nature of the beast, the news is about something as dramatic, and it's certainly, negative things are more dramatic and interesting than positive things generally. I remember my grandfather, probably back in the 60s or even 50s, saying that he stopped reading the daily newspaper because it was nothing but bad news, and made him feel bad. And so I think it's kind of generic. And I wonder, though, if there hasn't really been an uptick since 2001, since 9/11.
Sure.
We certainly feel a lot more vulnerable now, I think, than we have, at least in the years prior to that.
Absolutely. So let's keep dealing with that and look at it from a national level. You bring up 9/11. We look at the Y2K scare even prior to 9/11, Columbine prior to that, and now things like Ferguson. And so it has communities on edge. How is the coverage, the dialogue, because now we live in an internet age where these images are being flashed all over the world, basically at light speed. How does that continue to push what some might consider the culture of fear? And as we look at September 11th specifically, as we're just passing, I don't want to say the celebration, but the triumph that we're past that now. But every September 11th, we start to replay those images. How does that continue when you keep playing those images over and over? Instead of celebrating, look at we're rebuilding, you almost replay the terror in people's mind and cause the anxiety to play itself up again. How does that affect us as a culture? Kind of a loaded question, but just anyone feel free to jump in.
I think September 11th sort of posed kind of a fundamental question to the country. I mean, we have these ideals of, sort of the right to privacy and, I'm forgetting what I was going to say, with the right to privacy and sort of civil liberties and all of these things. But then September 11th made us wonder, well, should we trade some of that stuff? Because we're afraid. I mean, this was a horrible thing. Thousands of people died. We have a terrorist group or groups who now are determined to attack us here. I mean, terrorism was always something that happened in Africa or the Middle East or London, with the IRA, and now it was here. And I think the answer has been since then that because of our fear, and to some extent politicians who have been able to sort of play on that fear, we have traded civil liberties and our right to privacy and a lot of other things in exchange for that safety. I think the further we get from September 11th and the more we go on without terrorist attack, I think there's a more serious questioning of what we've given up, and there may actually be some moves to take some of that back. But at this point, I think the shadow of that event is still pretty dark, and I think we still fear terrorism, and now with ISIS, who also is making a lot of noise about attacking us here, I think you're going to see that friction become, increase as we go into, especially, the next presidential election in 2016. I think that tug of war between civil liberties and security, the security state, I mean, I think that's going to be a pretty big issue.
I think you're really onto something here, and this idea, especially after 9/11 and things like ISIS with terrorism, that was really Americans sharing in a culture of fear. I mean, we had patriotism as another emotion and another sentiment coming out of that, but Americans generally were, I don't want to say embracing, but embedded in a culture of fear after that terrorist attack, and maybe rightly so. I'm not making a judgment there, but this idea of giving up liberties leads to this idea that we need to turn to our officials to protect us for some sort of social control. And we're also responding, I think, as a culture emotionally, right? So rather than necessarily getting more information or digging beyond these headlines or sensationalism, the emotional response becomes paramount amongst Americans. They want something done, and they're willing to give up these liberties to do that. And I do think that the unifying culture of fear contributed to that.
Yeah, as a psychologist, I would wonder, are we more fearful in general? Are there more anxiety disorders than there were in the past? And I really don't know. I know that there are a lot of anxiety disorders. I think the statistics are something like about 18% in any given year of adults qualify for an anxiety disorder, and maybe close to 30% in lifetime. So, there's lots of anxiety that is kind of crippling for people. Is that greater than it was, say, 25 years ago? I don't know the answer to that. So I don't know for sure how that actually affects people on a personal level on a regular basis. As a psychologist, I tend to see lots of people in my office who are anxious, but that's a skewed sample. So.
Right, absolutely. So civil liberties, the thought of losing those because of the global war on terror, should people be fearful of, and on one side, going back to the way it was before September 11th, or should they be fearful that there are more cameras, there's more opportunity to invade citizens' privacy? So in one way, are we fighting fear with more fear? And how do you combat that if the way to eliminate fears is sort of more social controls?
Good question. My a gut reaction I have, and I don't know what my colleagues would say, is I would rather have the state looking after things than somebody who is throwing their weight around. And, so I'd rather the police stop someone who has a gun rather than me being vulnerable to that person with a gun who wants to, say, rob me.
Well, and for political leaders, there's a paradox always, because on the one hand, people don't like the NSA, collecting their data from their phones and their email and all the photos they've taken in the cloud and whatever else they're collecting. But on the other hand, if we're attacked and the public finds out that not every single thing was done that could have been done, then those same politicians that decided to back off in favor of civil liberties are attacked for not protecting the homeland. I mean, that's, the 2004 presidential election turned completely on this idea that John Kerry wasn't going to protect the homeland. You had the ad where the wolves running through the woods and who's going to protect you at night from the wolves. I mean, it was pretty sort of graphic imagery for politics. But yeah, I mean, that's always the question. And I think, like I say, since September 11th, we've sort of leaned toward that we like the government keeping tabs on all this stuff and keeping us safe. We haven't been attacked like that since then, so people feel like it's successful. What'll be interesting is if even with all of this security state, it still doesn't work, and then where do we turn?
Well, I certainly think that there's also a sentiment as far as the civil liberties and the wiretapping or surveillance is, if I'm not doing anything wrong, it's fine. And I also think if you're thinking about a younger generation, I teach college students, right? They sort of don't even think about it. I mean, this notion of privacy and what's on my phone, it's an expectation for them that, if somebody wants it, they're going to get it. Otherwise, if they're not doing anything wrong, then they're not concerned with it. And I say that to kind of lead into this idea of where is this culture of fear happening? And so I think it's both always with us, but also ebbs and flows. So what's the next thing that we're fearful about? You talked about the ISIS coming, right? So we're kind of in this lull, but something could be on the horizon for us to be fearful. And these different issues that we're fearful about, whether it's the abductions or when I was a child, it was the razors and the Halloween candy, right?
Yeah,
So with breaking news, with the way news cycle is, with the culture of fear permeating, it's one thing after another. So that could lead into this idea of how many anxiety orders do we have? Is that on the rise? Because there's always the next thing to be fearful about.
Well, and you mentioned the news cycle. I mean, we didn't, when I was young, even as big a sort of deal as the child abductions were, I can't imagine what it would have been like with a 24-hour, 3 cable news networks going nonstop. I mean, we have CNN or MSNBC or Fox on in the newsroom all the time, and you just sit there and watch it. Everything is breaking, everything is urgent, everything is just, I mean, it's sort of scary, but yet you can't look away.
Can't turn it away.
So, I mean, news coverage has changed a lot, especially television news. And with the internet, I mean, obviously that's also 24/7, and every development treated as a major development.
Updated,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Every story
Breaking
is
doesn't even
updated.
barely means anything now. It's like it used to be just sort of reserved for that, President Kennedy shot, urgent, but now it's everything's urgent.
I wanted to raise a question. You were saying about college students possibly not being as concerned about the privacy issues. And what I thought of when you were saying that is when I email something, I know that email is not a secure medium, but I sometimes email things that probably I shouldn't do because I don't have the technology in mind for secure email. And now we're thinking about those things. Can we email something without having it a secure email? So it's just another example of how we increasingly are concerned about privacy, about people are going to try to hurt us in some way.
And so does all the new forms of communication, the social media sites, all of this help to drive that? What I'm hearing is potentially, but it also, we have folks who don't care quite as much as maybe the older generation. But will those platforms be used to keep pushing the fear that, oh, something bad could potentially happen, so we need to make sure we're able to kind of help by looking over your shoulder? Does it drive that fear? Does it create safety in your mind? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it cuts both ways. I think that because of things like Twitter, because of Facebook, that we can have that information instantaneously, right? You can tweet to me that there's been X crime or whatever, and I can tweet it, and we can keep going and going and going. But that kind of medium, I also think, encourages people to try to find out more because they know they're getting only such a little bit of information. The flip side to that, I think, is because we're so connected, we also have this idea that we can look out for one another as well. So you can send your kid out to play, as you were saying, but you can have them check in every hour because they might be 12 and have a phone, right? So I think it still remains to be seen. And from my work on media, news and social media are still, I mean, they're still trying to figure out how traditional or legacy news and social media or new media are working together. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but as it becomes more commonplace, I think the demographics of who's using it is also going to change. So maybe that will influence, again, the younger generation that's more likely to be on social media or Twitter.
One thing that I thought of as we were talking here is the responses that people have to the fear. On the one hand, we have more the radical right, which is really emphasizing you have to protect yourself. Everybody should have a permit to carry, and if everybody was having guns, we'd be safer. And nobody could hurt you, and so on. And then on the other side, this emphasis on more government control and having more cameras and more giving up our freedoms so that somebody else can protect us. So I think maybe both are a response to kind of a sense of vulnerability.
Well, it's I think with social media, there's such differences between the platforms in that I think Twitter is sort of very news driven. People are constantly, at least maybe it's just my own Twitter feed because it's full of journalists, so, right. So I don't know. But then Facebook, it almost seems like sometimes is a place where people try to get away from what's happening in the world. I mean, and get away from those anxieties. And this is just, I mean, the way that this has played out with September 11th happening, we've got this sort of this war on terrorism that's gone on for more than a decade. And then we've got all of this economic insecurity and inequity in incomes and all of this uncertainty about what's going to happen with the American economy and where people are going to fit in because it's being remade with technology and then I mean it's just all of these anxieties coming together. I mean I just feel like this is such an uneasy time and I think I don't know if it's always just basic fear, but I do get a sense talking to readers, listening to what people say at public meetings and the way they're interacting with public officials, that there's just sort of a tension right now in the country and everywhere that I don't know exactly how to explain it, but it's it just seems like the country is on edge, and I'm not sure how we back ourselves away, but it's definitely there.
Let me ask a question before we run out of time, because we talk about people being on edge. We talk about just a certain angst. So we see, as you mentioned earlier, crime, violent crime is down, but we see heavy policing. We see if law enforcement's called, they don't come 1 or 2 anymore. There are 6 or 7 cars, and so what might just be an ordinary call, and you can send someone on their way, or you arrest someone and put them in the back of your car. What we have happening now is situations start to spin out of control a little bit. Do we see the fear of crime increasing the heavy policing? And if so, how do we strike a balance in neighborhoods that are already feeling like they're being occupied in the first place? How do we strike a balance with that?
Well, it seems like there are two impulses. I mean, you've got what you described, the heavy policing, but then you've got departments at least making a good attempt to sort of recreate kind of the connections with the neighborhoods that maybe police had, you know, years ago. I think the more we lean toward that sort of, that I guess it's the catchphrase is community policing, but basically what it is trying to get into the neighborhoods and show people that the police are there to serve them and not necessarily just to come knock on their door when something's wrong. I guess the more we lean that direction, the less toward sort of, you know, getting, you know, landmine resistant vehicles and things and body armor and assault weapons. I mean, I think if we, you know, try to get back to sort of a more basic neighborhood policing, we probably will have some good results and people will cooperate with the police again.
Diminishing that divide between us and them, right? So bringing the police and the citizens together, and not just police, but you mentioned other government officials or other community leaders, and really developing this sense of community. And I think things like, you know, federal money for police forces to have these military-grade equipment are not helping that cause. They're further separating us from them in those situations.
Okay. Well, just one more question because we're almost out of time. There's limited resources, so when we start talking about money, does that kind of help drive that divide? So economic development in communities, in cities, and so to make sure that we are keeping our communities safe, does that help to drive the divide between maybe the wealthy and the less wealthy?
I certainly think that if we take Ferguson, for example, part of what has fueled that has been this inequity, right? So folks, we talked earlier about tensions, folks who don't have access to jobs where they can maintain a standard of living, and folks who are struggling to make ends meet despite what we think of as the American work ethic of, you know, American ethic of working hard, right? It's going to increase those tensions. It's going to, people will turn to alternatives to make ends meet. And if we don't start addressing some of those broader issues of economic development, jobs in communities, resources in communities, food deserts, I mean, all of these sort of urban social ills that aren't just urban, that play out in multiple places, then we're going to continue to have situations where us and them develop.
Absolutely.
Well, and the politics is so polarized now that it's difficult to find solutions. I mean, it used to be, of course, Republicans didn't like big government programs. Democrats liked them better. We used to at least come together and try to figure out, you know, things like, I mean, Ronald Reagan signed the Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, there's sort of a demonization of the poor on the right. There's a demonization of the right on the left. Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to sort of come to terms with what we need to do economically at the exact time that we need people to come together. We aren't able to do it.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sorry our time is up. We've only scratched the surface of this topic of the culture of fear, but I certainly want to thank my guest, one, for your insight and your perspective, and hope that you, the viewer, will continue this dialogue even beyond today in order that we ensure people are not operating out of fear, but out of peace with one another. Perhaps the only thing we have to fear is a culture of fear itself. Good day.
Thank you.